Space had always frightened humanity for the wrong reasons. Not because it was dark, not because it was cold, not even because it was vast enough to make every city, every nation, every life on Earth feel like dust caught in a shaft of light. What terrified humanity most about space was the possibility that something older was already out there, watching us build our clumsy stations, our ugly freighters, our welded-together frontier habitats, and quietly deciding whether we were worth noticing. On the day that answer came, it did not arrive as a fleet. It arrived as a correction. At 9:14 Coordinated Solar Time, every active human system, from military command relays buried under mountains to civilian cargo routes drifting beyond the frost line, froze for exactly 3 seconds. No alarms, no warning, just a total seizure of the networks humanity had spent 2 centuries building into the nervous system of its species. Then every screen on Earth turned white, every helmet visor, every hospital monitor, every orbital traffic display, every school wall panel, every mining rig terminal, every command table, in every bunker. White, pure, and featureless, as if the entire species had been forced to stare at a blank page before a sentence was passed. When the image finally formed, panic started before the figure even spoke. It stood impossibly tall, draped in layered metallic fabric that seemed to move like liquid geometry. Behind it hung a field of stars bent into perfect concentric rings by some invisible force. And beneath those stars drifted ships so symmetrical, so polished, so offensively flawless that they did not look built at all. They looked ordained. The figure's voice was calm, musical, and utterly without strain. It informed humanity that its expansion had entered restricted dominion space. It informed humanity that its industrial spread, unauthorized colonies, and experimental drives constituted contamination. It informed humanity that resistance would be brief, mathematically irrelevant, and remembered only as an administrative inconvenience. Then it gave terms. Power down all off-world infrastructure. Transmit complete access to human navigation, manufacturing, and defense systems. Accept external governance and cultural oversight. Comply before the deadline expires, and a portion of the population would be permitted to continue under managed supervision. Refuse, and the species would be reduced to a historical footnote. There was no shouting, no theatrical threat. That made it worse. The being spoke with the bored precision of an auditor reading out penalties to a failed company. And then, with a kind of ceremonial cruelty, the transmission expanded. Not just words. Proof, specs, power curves, weapons architecture, fleet harmonics, shielding models, engine outputs, enough raw technical data to make every human engineer on the planet understand the same horrifying fact at once. Whoever had sent this message was not bluffing. Their machines were cleaner, stronger, faster, and centuries beyond anything humanity had ever fielded. Across Earth, the first screams began. Markets cratered in less than a minute. Emergency sirens rolled through cities that had never imagined they would need them. Orbital traffic dissolved into chaos. In the belt habitats, people started sealing compartments before anyone told them to. On the frontier stations, families sent goodbye messages because they assumed there would not be time later. Deep beneath the surface of Callisto, in a command vault built for wars no one had believed would ever come, the senior staff of the Outer Defense Assembly stood around a silent tactical table and watched the invaders' fleet bloom across the projection. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Dr. Sarah Vale, the civilian systems analyst nobody had wanted in the room until an hour ago, leaned toward the stream of enemy telemetry with narrowed eyes. "Hold on," she said. The words were soft, but they cut through the paralysis like a blade. Admiral Jonas Rice turned toward her. "What?" Vale didn't answer immediately. Her fingers moved across the interface, isolating a repeating pattern buried inside the invader's combat architecture. The more she looked, the less afraid she seemed, which, under the circumstances, was its own kind of terror. Finally, she glanced up at the Admiral and asked the question that changed the temperature of the room. "If they're truly untouchable," she said, "why did they need us to see how they fight?" For the first 6 minutes after the transmission ended, nobody in the Callisto vault spoke above a whisper. It was not discipline. It was something closer to instinct, as if volume itself might provoke the thing that had just reached through every wall humanity had ever built and reminded the species how small it really was. Around the tactical chamber, projection layers kept refreshing in overlapping sheets of data. Civilian unrest maps, fleet readiness reports, orbital traffic collapse, emergency declarations from Earth, Mars, Titan, Ganymede, Luna, automated casualty models blooming red across colony clusters closest to the frontier. Every screen in the room offered a different way to say the same thing. Humanity had just discovered it was not alone, and the universe had not introduced itself with curiosity. Admiral Jonas Rice stood at the head of the table with both palms pressed flat against the edge of the display, staring down at the wire-frame bloom of the hostile formation. He was not a dramatic man. His reputation had been built on surviving things other officers called unwinnable by refusing to panic in front of people who still could, thick-shouldered, iron gray at the temples, and so steady that junior officers jokingly called him a pressure hull in uniform. He had spent the last 14 years commanding convoy defense in the outer systems. He had fought pirates. He had broken secession blockades. He had watched stations go dark with thousands still inside. But he had never once in his career looked at a tactical problem and felt the old, primitive part of his mind whisper, predator. Across from him stood Chancellor Elian Marr, political director of the Outer Defense Assembly and at present, the most exhausted man in human space. He had arrived in the chamber 20 minutes earlier in a formal jacket over an emergency thermal layer, his face gray with the kind of stress that came from being forced to think about surrender before the word itself was politically survivable. He did not care anymore. They took every network we have, Marr said, voice tight and brittle. Every military layer, every civilian layer, every fallback lattice. They bypassed quantum authentication. As if it were decorative, they did it without firing a shot. We need to stop pretending this is a war briefing and accept what it is. Nobody responded. That silence irritated him. This, Marr said, pointing at the enemy formation, is a dictated settlement. We can call it an ultimatum if the language makes us feel less weak, but they've already demonstrated total systems dominance. If we provoke them, we are gambling the species on pride. At the far end of the chamber, someone shifted. Dr. Sarah Vale had not bothered to sit since the transmission began. She stood in the blue wash of the main display, wearing a civilian analyst coat over a grease-marked work suit, one sleeve still darkened from contact coolant. She had been pulled from a research stack on Europa 2 months earlier after a logistics model she built for freight harmonics accidentally exposed a vulnerability in military convoy routing. Since then, half the brass viewed her as a genius and the other half as an irritant who made certainty difficult. She preferred the second group. They were usually closer to being honest. She enlarged a section of the alien fleet architecture and rotated it in silence. Marr noticed, Doctor, unless your model can produce a surrender package that keeps the major population centers intact, I suggest we stay focused on realities. Vale kept studying the projection. I am focused on reality, she said. Then tell me I'm wrong. She looked at him at last. You are wrong in the way prey is usually wrong. That got the room's attention. Several officers exchanged glances. Chancellor Marr stared at her, as if unsure whether he had just been insulted or rescued. Rice straightened slightly. Explain. Vale expanded the enemy telemetry into multiple layers. Weapons cadence, formation spacing, shield modulation, command pulse architecture. It was beautiful, in the way avalanches were beautiful. Clean lines, elegant inevitability, no wasted motion. The hostile fleet did not maneuver like a collection of ships. It behaved like a single thought distributed across metal. That transmission wasn't just intimidation, she said. It was liturgy. No one spoke. She tapped the display again. Look at the release structure. Their threat was synchronized with fleet telemetry, system dominance proofs, and doctrinal reveal. They didn't merely tell us surrender was logical. They performed superiority as a ritual sequence. General murmurs stirred around the table. One intelligence officer frowned. You're saying this is cultural? I'm saying it's operational because it's cultural. Vale replied. Those are not separate categories for a civilization this old. She isolated a pulse lattice threading through the alien formation. This, she said, is the part that matters. Their command architecture doesn't prioritize redundancy the way ours does. It prioritizes coherence. Every ship is being updated, corrected, and harmonized against a central doctrine state in real time. Their fleet isn't coordinating. It's conforming. Rice's expression changed, but only slightly. With him, slight changes mattered. Mar folded his arms. You're describing efficiency. No, Vale said. I'm describing dependency. The room quieted again. She pulled up comparison models. Human formations looked ugly by contrast, messy, overlapping, compartmentalized, full of conflicting redundancies and independent command chains that had evolved through centuries of accidents, disasters, politics, and wars no one had agreed on while they were happening. The alien fleet resembled a cathedral. And cathedrals, Vale said softly, are magnificent until something breaks the symmetry. Admiral Rice turned his eyes back to the projection. How confident are you? On what? That this is a weakness. Vale was silent for just a second too long. Not confident enough to bet my life on it, she said. Confident enough to bet everyone else's if the alternative is kneeling. The bluntness landed hard. Even now, several officers winced when civilians spoke in numbers at large. Military people prefer their abstractions wrapped in procedure. Civilians often had the indecency to say what the math meant. Mar exhaled sharply. There it is. Recklessness disguised as insight. No, Vale said. Pattern recognition disguised as bad bedside manner. Rice raised one hand, ending the exchange before it could become theatrical. Assume you're right. What does that give us? Vale did not answer immediately. Instead, she changed the display again. The alien fleet vanished. In its place appeared the industrial map of the outer system. Breaker yards on Callisto, stripped freighter hulks in high anchor over Amalthea, tungsten mass trains in Jovian transfer lanes, decommissioned reactor spines parked in legal limbo, magnetic launch cradles old enough to predate current safety law, or catapults, cargo ring arrays, abandoned war platforms too expensive to dismantle and too embarrassing to acknowledge on official inventories. To Chancellor Mar, it looked like salvage. To Jonas Rice, it looked like memory. To Sarah Vale, it looked like language. They think war is a perfected thing, she said. A solved form. Centralized. Harmonized. Beautiful. Her hand swept across the map of human infrastructure. We don't. Now the room leaned in. A logistics commander squinted. You think we can retrofit industrial hardware into combat platforms in 72 hours? Vale shook her head. Not platforms. What then? She zoomed in on 6 heavy freight lanes and a cluster of obsolete magnetic mass drivers orbiting in maintenance lock. We don't need to outbuild them, she said. We need to force them into a problem their doctrine doesn't know how to describe. Chancellor Mar's patience snapped. You are speaking in riddles while cities are already tearing themselves apart. As if summoned by the words, the emergency wall to the left refreshed with fresh civilian feeds. Riots in the Nairobi Arcology, emergency marshal closures in the Tharsis corridor, evacuation surges at Luna transfer elevators, a food panic in Titan South, 3 outer habitats broadcasting intent to open, independent channels to the invaders if central government could not guarantee protection. Humanity was beginning to fracture exactly the way frightened civilizations always did. Locally, selfishly, and all at once. That, more than the alien fleet, chilled Rice. No civilization was ever conquered from the outside first. It came apart from the seams. Mar pointed at the feeds. Those are the realities. We have maybe hours before half the frontier tries to save itself by negotiating separately. And that, Vale said, is why they sent the data. The Chancellor turned. What? They don't just want surrender. They want synchronized surrender. That's the whole point. One species, one submission, one clean transfer of authority. Fear is part of their command structure. Rice's gaze hardened. You think panic is helping them tactically. I know it is. She brought up the alien broadcast sequencing again, this time aligned against human communication breakdowns. The correlation was ugly. Targeted public overwhelm. Proof of futility. Engineered social fragmentation. Pressure toward unilateral capitulation. The invaders had not merely threatened war. They had triggered political collapse as a precursor to war, which means, Rice said slowly, if we look disorganized enough, they relax into expectation. Vale finished, not because they're stupid, because they're old. Old powers mistake repeated success for natural law. The admiral finally stepped away from the table and began pacing once around its circumference. That was when everyone in the room understood he was no longer evaluating the theory. He was evaluating implementation. Mar saw it too, and his face drained. You cannot be considering this. I'm considering everything. Jonas, if we make one wrong move. We already have, Rice said. We built outward assuming first contact would be curious before it was hierarchical. Mar lowered his voice. If you gamble and fail, you won't be remembered as defiant. You'll be remembered as the man who got the species killed because he couldn't tell the difference between courage and denial. Rice stopped pacing. When he turned, there was no anger in him. That somehow made it worse. And if I kneel before something that intends to put a collar on every world we've built, he said, what exactly do you think that gets remembered as? The Chancellor had no answer ready. An operations lieutenant at the lower tier suddenly looked up from her station. Admiral. Rice moved toward her instantly. Report. She swallowed once. Intercepted bursts from the frontier colony bands. 3 stations in the Hecate Drift are preparing independent surrender declarations. They're requesting protected status from the alien force in exchange for local compliance. Mark closed his eyes. There it was. The fracture. 1 more hour, maybe 2, and humanity would begin kneeling in pieces. Rice looked back to Vale. If we move, how much of your model is still theory? She met his stare without blinking. Most of the interesting parts. A few people actually laughed at that. Short, disbelieving sounds from nerves stretched too thin to behave properly. It lasted less than a second, but it changed the room. Not because anything was less serious. Because it was. And because fear, once interrupted, sometimes returned as momentum. Rice gave his orders with frightening calm. Seal all independent frontier channels. Quietly reroute civilian traffic around the Callisto industrial spine. Wake reserve engineering crews from every breaker yard and freight dock under assembly authority. Pull the obsolete mass driver inventories from archive lock and flag them under emergency military conversion. Compartmentalize the operation to black tier authorization. And finally, bring Vale every piece of captured telemetry and raw systems architecture from the alien broadcast, unfiltered, including anything intelligence had withheld for political review. Mars stared at him. You're bypassing civilian oversight. I'm bypassing paralysis. You are starting a war. Rice looked once at the projection of the fleet hanging over human space like a sentence already written. No, he said. They started it when they mistook compliance for the only intelligent response. The chamber surged into motion. Orders flashed. Secure lines opened. Old hardware woke to new purpose. Across the outer system, thousands of workers who thought their lives involved freight, salvage, reactor maintenance, or guidance began receiving sealed directives that made no sense in peacetime. Only Vale stayed still. Rice noticed. Something else. She hesitated. That, more than anything she had said so far, unsettled him. There's one more problem, she said. The room slowed around her. Rice's eyes narrowed. Go on. Vale pulled up a faint, half-resolved signal architecture buried beneath the primary fleet lattice. Something deeper, colder, more distant. Her voice dropped. This force may not be the invasion. The silence that followed felt heavier than the moon above them. She expanded the pattern. It may be the question. And for the first time since the transmission began, even Admiral Jonas Rice forgot to speak. By the 4th hour after the ultimatum, humanity had stopped asking whether the enemy could kill them. That question had already been answered. The better question, the one creeping through command channels, emergency cabinets, military think tanks, and sleepless engineering bays, was whether the invaders understood the kind of species they had just threatened. In the Callisto vault, the room had changed shape without moving an inch. Earlier, it had felt like a bunker waiting for impact. Now it felt like a machine spinning up around an idea too dangerous to name out loud. Officers moved faster. Analysts stopped explaining every intermediate conclusion. Data packets flew between sealed stations under. Fresh layers of compartmentalization. Emergency authorization chains bent until they almost snapped. Somewhere beyond the armored walls, breaker crews were dragging obsolete mass driver assemblies out of dry lock. Freight tugs were being quietly reassigned. And industrial supervisors were waking workers who still believed they were reporting for routine maintenance rotations. Panic still existed. It just no longer had exclusive ownership of the room. That should have been comforting. It was not, because the more information Dr. Sarah Vale uncovered, the less this resembled a single fleet action, and the more it resembled a civilization colliding with a doctrine older than most human religions. She stood at the central display with 3 projection planes open around her, each one carrying a different interpretation of the same alien transmission. Signal patterns, fleet state harmonics, symbol clusters embedded in command routines. She had not blinked much in the last 20 minutes. Admiral Jonas Rice had learned this about her already. Whenever she got closer to something important, she looked less human, not more, not colder, exactly, but more absorbed, as if ordinary social performance became an unacceptable tax on attention. "Show me again," Rice said. Vale zoomed out from the hostile fleet and opened a fresh overlay beneath it. "This is the part intelligence tagged as ceremonial contamination and deprioritized for tactical review," she said. No one in the room enjoyed the way several intelligence officers suddenly found reasons to study their consoles. Marr, who had remained in the chamber despite repeated requests from his own security staff to relocate to a deeper continuity shelter, rubbed both hands over his face and muttered, "Wonderful." Vale continued. Embedded throughout the invaders' transmission were recurring non-functional sequences, at least non-functional by human standards. Rhythmic redundancies, symbolic repetitions, harmonic spacing with no obvious computational necessity. To early machine review, they had looked like signature flourishes or cultural ornamentation attached to a military message by a civilization too vain to separate beauty from intimidation. But the more Vale mapped them against command routing, the more a different picture emerged. "They do separate beauty from intimidation," she said. "They just don't separate either from authority." One of the signal officers frowned. Meaning their command system doesn't merely transmit orders. It reinforces legitimacy. She expanded the pattern into a rotating lattice. Streams of encrypted fleet state traffic braided together with recurring symbolic anchors that pulsed at mathematically precise intervals. Every update to ship posture, weapons readiness, shield state, and positional alignment is cross-verified against Central Command identity markers, not for security alone, for ideological continuity. General Silence, then Commander Imani Quill, Tactical Systems Chief and one of the few people in the room comfortable interrupting Vale, without sounding defensive, folded her arms and said, "Say that in language the rest of us can hate immediately." Vale didn't smile. "It means they built their religion into the battle space." That landed, not because it was poetic, because everyone in the room knew exactly how ugly things got when institutions stopped being systems and started being sacred. Marr lowered his voice. "You're saying their fleet obeys because it believes? I'm saying their ships are designed around a civilization that stopped expecting meaningful dissent a very long time ago." She rotated the hostile formation again. Seen through that lens, everything about it changed. The symmetry was no longer mere vanity. The command pulse architecture was no longer just efficient. The ritualized demand for synchronized surrender was no longer theatrical. It was doctrinal. The Empire did not simply conquer. It converted disorder into hierarchy and called that peace. Rice watched the cathedral-like formation drift across the projection. And if that harmony breaks? Vale looked at him. "They don't just lose tactical cohesion," she said. "They lose the story that tells them they can't." A murmur moved across the room. Not relief. Relief was still too expensive, but something related to it. The first shape of a possibility. No one wanted to touch too soon. Then the side wall flashed scarlet. A new burst of frontier traffic rolled in. Independent surrender petitions. Now 7 stations, not 3. One of the petitions included civilian signatures from a habitat council in the Hecate Drift. Another came from a refinery cluster near the shadow lanes, already transmitting cargo logs and life support schematics in exchange for what they called preliminary recognition under external administration. Mar went pale. "They're doing it," he said. "God help us. They're doing already." Rice did not look away from the wall feed. "Can we stop the packets?" "Some." Quill said. "Not all. They're piggybacking through civilian relays and maintenance drift channels. Too many small vectors." Mar turned on Rice. "This is exactly what I warned you about. Humanity does not have 72 hours. We have maybe 6 before local self-preservation shreds the chain of command." Rice's jaw tightened, but it was Vale who answered. "That's because the chain of command was the first target," she said. Then she pulled up the alien broadcast chronology again. Not the words, not the visual spectacle, but the sequence itself. Demand, proof of inevitability, aesthetic dominance, technical overexposure, deadline. It looked, suddenly, less like a threat and more like a key designed to unlock one specific human response. Panic-driven fragmentation. "They didn't just show us power," Vale said. "They administered helplessness in stages." "And you sound impressed," Mar snapped. "I am impressed," Vale said flatly. "That's how I know it's deliberate." Rice stepped in before the exchange could spiral. "What else?" For the first time, Vale hesitated in a way that suggested the answer might genuinely be worse than the room was ready for. Then she changed the display. The hostile fleet pulled back. Deep background telemetry emerged beneath it, faint, delayed, and partially phase-obscured by the primary signal surge. Most of it had looked like noise during the first pass. Under Vale's filters, it resolved into structured absences, gaps where something should have been louder if the first fleet were acting alone. Quill leaned forward. "That's not empty space." "No," Vale said. "It isn't." A second lattice began to form. Not local, not immediate, but there, like pressure behind a sealed door. Mar stared at it, suddenly breathing too fast. "How many?" "Can't tell yet." "Estimate." Vale did not answer. Rice did it for her. "Enough to make the first fleet expendable." No one spoke after that. The implications settled over the chamber with the slow certainty of poison. This beautiful force hanging above human space. This overwhelming engine of dominance that had already pushed whole populations toward surrender. Might not be the blade. It might be the measuring instrument. A judgment fleet. A doctrinal test. A first knock on the door before the real hand closed. Mar took a step backward, then another, as if physical distance might lessen the fact of it. "Then there is no point," he said. "Do you understand? Even if your analysis is perfect, even if we bloody this force somehow, we teach the rest of them what not to do." Vale turned toward him. "Yes," she said. The simplicity of it made him recoil. "That doesn't bother you?" "Of course it bothers me." "You don't sound bothered." "I sound busy." That almost started another argument, but Quill cut in. "Suppose we break their command coherence," she said. "Suppose we actually pull it off. What happens after first contact becomes first resistance?" Vale's eyes flicked back to the deeper signal lattice. "We become a case study." Rice absorbed that in silence. For a long moment the room held still around the fact that survival and escalation might now be the same road. Then one of the lower-tier analysts called out, voice cracking slightly, "We've got something from the retrieval team." All heads turned. 2 hours earlier, under Black authorization, Rice had dispatched a covert acquisition unit toward the Kepri extraction spine, a contested industrial cluster near the outer system, where old military infrastructure overlapped with civilian gravitic survey arrays. On paper, the mission was simple: recover archive hardware profiles and a sealed set of experimental field models too politically toxic to keep on active military servers. In reality, it was the kind of mission commanders launch when they needed one more variable before making a decision history would either glorify or treat as evidence. The analyst patched the feed through. Static, then a helmet cam, shaking hard. The scene was chaos. Half-lit scaffolding over a rotating industrial trench. Warning lights pulsing through steam and drifting particulate. Voices shouted over each other in clipped bursts. Something had gone wrong. Rice stepped forward. "Team Kepri report." A face appeared for half a second, blood at the temple, visor cracked. Archive is gone, the operative said. Not deleted, lifted. Somebody got here first. The room sharpened. Who? Rice demanded. Don't know. No insignia. Clean work. They stripped only the nonlinear field packages and left the rest. Vale went still. That was the first thing Rice noticed. Not what the operative had said. Her reaction to it. Doctor? He said. She didn't answer immediately. The helmet feed continued in broken flashes. Wrecked access doors. Cut rails. A maintenance drone split open by directed heat. Then the operative's voice again, lower now, strained. There's more. We found transmission residue on site. Not ours. Not local. Alien? Quill asked. Maybe. Maybe not. Pattern doesn't match the main fleet. Now everyone was looking at Vale. Because everyone in the room suddenly understood the same thing at once. If someone else had taken the models before human command could secure them, then the crisis had already become layered. This was no longer humanity versus one empire. This was humanity inside a battle space it did not fully see. Mar whispered, almost to himself, there are other players. Vale finally spoke, or other versions of the same one. Rice turned to her sharply. Meaning? But before she could answer, the operative on the feed shouted something unintelligible. The camera pitched sideways, and the transmission cut into static so violent it blanked half the wall. 3 seconds later, all lights in the Callisto chamber dimmed. Not failed, dimmed. Every console in the room flickered to a single message strand in untranslated alien glyphs. No image this time. No figure. No speech. Just one line, repeated across every surface like a pulse. Not the ultimatum. Something new. Vale stared at it. Face drained of color for the first time since the crisis began. Rice saw that and felt a colder fear than the first broadcast had produced. What does it say? Vale swallowed once. When she answered, her voice had lost all trace of academic detachment. It says the test has begun. For 3 full seconds after the glyphs appeared, nobody in the Callisto vault moved. The message did not flash like a warning or pulse like an attack alert. It simply sat there, cold and centered on every screen, as if the room itself had decided to stop pretending humanity was still in control of its own machines. The test has begun. The translation overlay rendered it in clean military font beneath the original symbols, which only made it worse. No distortion. No uncertainty. No room to argue that the software might have guessed wrong. Admiral Jonas Rice kept his voice level by force, locked the room off-grid. Commander Imani Quill was already moving, trying. Her fingers flew over the hard console controls, bypassing the network layer entirely and forcing command priority through buried physical architecture older than most of the staff in the chamber. Around the vault, armored shutters began sealing secondary interfaces. Optical relays severed. Portable units went dark. Data ports physically retracted into the walls. The chamber was converting from command hub to isolated citadel, and still the message remained. Not because the lockout had failed, because whatever had written itself across their systems was already inside. Chancellor Elian Mar stared at the glyphs like a man watching the floor crack beneath his feet. Tell me that's bluffing. No one did. Sarah Vale stepped closer to the central display and to the alien characters reflected in her eyes. It isn't talking to the public, she said quietly. Rice turned. Meaning? The first transmission was spectacle. This isn't. This was injected after we started moving. Her voice sharpened as a pattern assembled in her head. Someone is watching for response signatures. Quill looked up from her console. Monitoring command reaction? Monitoring deviation, Vale said. The ultimatum was broad-spectrum pressure. This is selective. It appeared only after we compartmentalized, rerouted industrial channels, and woke reserve engineering. That means one of two things. Rice already knew he would hate both options. Say them. 1, Vale said, the fleet above us has enough live telemetry penetration to infer command intent from our internal traffic, despite the lockdown. Mark closed his eyes. And 2, Rice asked. Vale glanced once at the dead Kepri feed, still hanging in the corner of the wall. There's another layer in system that changed the room faster than any speech could have. The alien armada above the frontier was one thing. Vast, visible, impossible. People knew how to fear obvious monsters. But the possibility of a second unseen actor, an observer, infiltrator, or doctrinal enforcement element operating beneath the main fleet's shadow was something else entirely. It turned strategy into paranoia. Rice made his decision before the fear could root. Assume both. Quill straightened. Admiral, assume they can read us from above and watch us from inside. That becomes the planning baseline until reality is kind enough to get simpler. He pointed across the room. New compartment rules. No strategy fragments longer than 30 seconds on any live system. Hard copy relay where possible. Decoy chatter on every industrial band we can afford to lose. If they want to watch humanity respond, we give them too many responses to sort. Mars stared at him. You're escalating blind. No, Rice said. I'm denying them clean data. That, at least, was a language everyone in the room understood. Within minutes, the vault split into layers. The official channel, the one any hostile observer would have easiest access to, filled with frantic but plausible confusion. Relocation debates, civilian evacuation arguments, contradictory readiness orders, surrender contingency drafts, and deliberately noisy logistics reroutes that suggested political paralysis overtaking military action. Beneath that visible layer, real work accelerated. Humanity's first advantage had never been elegance. It was clutter, redundancy, historical scar tissue. 1,000 overlapping systems no planner would have designed from scratch because they only existed after accidents, budget wars, salvage improvisations, and previous failures no one had wanted to repeat. If the enemy's strength was coherent control, then humanity's only hope lay in becoming unreadable while appearing broken. Vale stood over a paper map now. Actual polymer sheets dragged from emergency archives because analog tools had suddenly become strategic assets. Across the table, she marked freight lanes, dead shipyard spines, abandoned orbital handling cradles, and obsolete magnetic infrastructure that still existed mainly because dismantling it cost more than pretending it wasn't there. Commander Quill frowned down at the spread. You're still thinking industrial conversion. I'm thinking industrial misdirection first, Vale said. If they're testing how we react, we don't show them a defense posture. We show them species-level panic with pockets of disorganized defiance. Mar let out a bitter laugh. That part won't require much performance. Rice ignored him. What does the real posture become? Vale tapped 6 positions spread across the outer system. Mass, asymmetry, and false priorities. Quill followed the markings. You want them looking at shipyards. I want them expecting ships. That pulled Rice's attention fully onto her, and instead, Vale met his eyes. We weaponize the infrastructure they think is beneath military relevance. The room stayed silent, but it was a charged kind now. The silence of specialists seeing a shape before they had language for it. Vale continued. Their doctrine expects recognizable war forms. Fleets, batteries, launch platforms, escalation ladders. They read hierarchy in geometry. So we stop thinking in ships and start thinking in trajectories. Cargo mass, industrial acceleration, field distortion, harmonic overload. We don't beat them with better warcraft. We force them to process an attack profile their command culture classifies as contamination. Quill slowly folded her arms. You want to turn the frontier economy into a battlefield. Vale did not soften it. It already is. Outside the vault, proof arrived by the hour. The Hecate Drift surrender attempts had become a flood. 9 habitats now, then 12, then 17. Civilian councils, refinery boards, colonial governors, life support cooperatives. Everyone seeking separate survival before Central Command could choose for them. A mining consortium in the outer lanes even attached a formal statement arguing that cooperation with external stabilizing authority might preserve economic continuity better than coordinated resistance. That particular packet made half the room swear aloud. Mar didn't. He simply looked 20 years older. This is how species die, he said. Not all at once. By conversion of fear into private deals. Rice knew he was right. Every independent channel that opened was not merely a political wound. It was intelligence leakage. The invaders didn't need to conquer a united humanity if panic convinced humanity to map itself for them. So Rice authorized a measure he had been resisting for 3 hours. Seal authority. Frontier communication blackouts spread in widening cones from assembly-controlled relays. Civilian outrage erupted instantly, but the channels went dark anyway. Across multiple colonies, families lost contact with relatives. Trade boards screamed about economic collapse. Local governors issued protests. A dozen news syndicates accused the military of staging an information coup during first contact. They were not entirely wrong. Marr cornered Rice near the tactical wall as fresh protests rolled in. You realize what this will look like if we survive. Do not do that now. Rice held his gaze. If we survive, Marr said through clenched teeth, history will say the military strangled civilian governance in the first hours of alien contact. Rice looked toward the map, where surrender petitions had been turning human space into a patchwork of private desperation. If we don't, he said, history doesn't get a vote. That ended the argument, but not the fracture between them. It widened further 2 hours later. A punitive strike hit Kepri. No warning. No grand broadcast. No fleet maneuver visible on long-range arrays. One moment the extraction spine was a damaged but salvageable industrial site with missing archive and a dead covert team. The next, every surviving sensor in the sector registered a surgical burst of impossible energy that punched through the station's upper superstructure, boiled metal into gas, and left 7,000 workers either dead or sealed inside collapsing pressure blocks. The projection arrived in pieces, static-scarred helmet feeds, thermal bloom maps, emergency distress fragments, radiation spikes. Then silence. The chamber froze again, but this time not from abstract fear. Everyone in the vault knew someone who knew someone stationed along those industrial lines. Kepri was not a strategic symbol. It was where real people worked ugly jobs under hard gravity for decent pay and worse retirement odds. Humanity could rationalize fleets and doctrines. It could not rationalize watching civilians vaporize because somewhere nearby an admiral had started thinking creatively. Marr spoke first, voice flat with horror. They know. Vale shook her head. No, this wasn't a targeted counter to the real operation. It hit the visible chaos layer. It was punishment. Punishment for what? Marr demanded. For hesitation, Rice said. And there was again not merely war, but behavioral conditioning. The invaders were teaching the species that disorder brought immediate pain. Panic faster. Comply cleaner. Quill slammed one fist into the console edge. Once, hard enough to bruise. Then they've shortened the leash. As if an answer, a new system-wide packet tore through every emergency band. No visual envoy this time. No grand aesthetic superiority. Just a revised notice. Deadline reduced. Humanity no longer had 72 hours. It had 30. The words hung over the room, like a blade dropped one notch lower. For a moment, even Rice said nothing. 30 hours was no longer strategic time. It was mechanical time. Crew time. Loading time. Burn time. Transit time. Failure time. The kind of clock that turned every decision into triage. Vale was already recalculating. That means they're unsatisfied with passive collapse, she said. They want force convergence before resistance can become coordinated. Marr rounded on her. Can your plan still happen in 30? She did the math in silence. Then, yes. No one relaxed. Marr understood first. That is not an answer that comforts me. It shouldn't. Quill moved closer to the map. What breaks first? Vale pointed at one of the 6 marked positions, a massive civilian orbital transfer cradle over Callisto, officially scheduled for deconstruction next quarter. It had the field geometry they needed to fake a harmless logistics cascade while hiding the first phase of the real acceleration structure underneath. Rice saw the problem immediately. That cradle still houses evacuees from the palace ration riots. 13,000, Quill said. 14 after this morning's intake. Someone corrected from the lower tier. Marr stared at the marker, then at Vale. No, Vale didn't look away. If we lose that geometry, we lose the timing window. There isn't another structure with the same mass alignment inside 30 hours. You are not asking to requisition hardware, Mar said, voice rising. You are asking to hollow out a civilian refuge in the middle of a species panic because your model likes the angles. My model, Vale said, equally cold now, like survival. Mar looked to Rice. Tell me this isn't even under consideration. Rice didn't answer at once, and that was answer enough. The Chancellor's composure finally broke. This is madness. You are about to gamble thousands of terrified civilians on a theory built from enemy ritual analysis and scrap metal improvisation. No, Rice said. I'm deciding whether their deaths now prevent billions later. Mar stepped back from him as if something fundamental had just become visible. For the first time since the invasion message, Jonas Rice felt not fear, but exhaustion pressed through the steel in his voice. This was the real cost of command. Not shouting, not bravery. Arithmetic with human faces attached. He looked toward the darkened wall, where Kepri's casualty estimate kept climbing as rescue attempts failed one by one. Then he looked at the transfer cradle marker. 14,000 civilians. 30 hours. One strategic window. Maybe. He turned to Quill. How long to evacuate the cradle if we burn every hidden transport asset we have? Quill answered immediately because she had already run it. 21 hours if nothing goes wrong. 27 if anything does. Too slow, Vale said. Mar glared at her. People aren't cargo mass, Doctor. No, Vale said. They're the reason the timing matters. Rice shut his eyes for one heartbeat, then opened them again. Prepare partial evacuation. Mar went rigid. Jonas. Prepare it, Rice repeated. Quietly. No panic burst. Priority list by mobility and life support fragility. Mar's voice dropped to something almost broken. And the ones you can't move? The Admiral looked at the map, at the deadline, at the invisible architecture of an empire trying to teach humanity the shape of obedience. Then he gave the order that divided the room, the government, and perhaps his own soul straight down the center. We proceed before the window closes. No one spoke after that, not because they agreed, because they understood. The operation began without announcement, ceremony, or anything history would later recognize as a proper opening move of a war. No speech, no fleet anthem, no flags rising over a bridge. Just hundreds of sealed directives moving through freight routes, breaker yards, tug depots, abandoned launch rings, and maintenance platforms scattered across the outer system like fragments of a civilization that had never intended its industrial skeleton to become a weapon. That was the first layer of the plan. The second layer was uglier. Over Callisto, the civilian transfer cradle designated Aster, 9 continued broadcasting the ordinary signals of a stressed but functioning evacuation hub. Docking queues, ration updates, medbay overflow, life support redistribution. To any observer with access to the visible communication layer, it still looked like what it had been yesterday, a temporary refuge hanging in cold orbit, overpopulated and under strain. Inside, 14,000 civilians were being moved through controlled sectors with the kind of quiet urgency that only worked when people were too frightened to ask the right questions in time. The partial evacuation had started. It was not fast enough. In the sealed command vault below, Chancellor Elian Mar stood over the timing board with his hands clasped so hard the knuckles had gone colorless. Every 10 minutes, the estimate updated. Every update told the same story in different numbers. Not enough time. Not enough transport volume. Too many fragile lives concentrated in the wrong place for history to care whether the geometry had been chosen or inherited. Mar stared at the figures until they blurred, then looked toward Admiral Jonas Rice and said what everyone else in the room was thinking. Tell me again this is still the least terrible option. Rice did not turn from the tactical wall. No, that answer somehow hurt more than reassurance would have. Across the chamber, Commander Imani Quill was coordinating the concealed conversion of 6 industrial nodes into something no enemy doctrine would classify as a coherent attack posture until it was far too late. Freight tugs loaded with tungsten or containers drifted under civilian registry masks. Decommissioned mass driver spines came awake in fragments, never all at once, each one hidden inside legitimate-looking maintenance pulses. Field regulators salvaged from dead reactor stations were stitched into alignment across a web of infrastructure so crude and improvised that half the engineering crews involved still did not understand the total shape of what they were building. That was deliberate. If anyone was watching, and by now they all assumed someone was, then knowledge itself had become a vulnerability. Sarah Vale stood in the middle of that uncertainty like the eye of a storm nobody trusted. Projection bands moved around her in rotating layers. Trajectory windows, lattice harmonics, command pulse resonance models, enemy formation correction timings. Every few minutes she altered one variable, and 3 other things changed with it. Her face was drawn from sleep loss, her voice flatter than usual, but her mind seemed to be accelerating under pressure rather than breaking beneath it. Rice had seen officers do that in battle. He had seen it consume them later. Quill looked up from her station. Aster, 9 conversion threshold in 118 minutes. Mar flinched. Rice didn't. How many clear? 4,212. That left nearly 10,000 still inside. The chamber absorbed the number in silence. Then a lower-tier analyst snapped upright over a signal console. We've got a movement. The hostile fleet above the system had finally responded to humanity's visible behavior shift. Across the projection, the invaders' formation adjusted, not into attack posture, but into observation depth. Their outer geometry widened. Several capital elements repositioned with extraordinary elegance, not toward the hidden industrial nodes, but toward the false pressure points humanity had seeded into the public channels. Emergency shipyard activity, contradictory retreat corridors, a pair of militia musters around worthless anchor positions. Vale saw it and exhaled once, very softly. Quill noticed. Good news? It means they're still reading us through doctrine. Rice stepped closer. Explain. They're not hunting improvisation, Vale said. They're classifying hierarchy. They assume any meaningful resistance will concentrate into recognizable military centers, because that's what mature civilization does. Mar gave a tired, bitter sound. So we survive because we're apparently not mature. Vale didn't even glance at him. For the moment, yes. The first phase had moved into execution. At synchronized marks across the system, 6 industrial sectors began broadcasting subtle, conflicting stress signatures. Not enough to look like an attack, just enough to drag portions of the alien command harmony into active correction mode. Power anomalies where no warship should be. Transit congestion bending into impossible patterns. Mass reallocations that looked too large for civilian chaos, yet too disorganized for military design. Every anomaly on its own could be dismissed. Together, they formed a puzzle the hostile fleet could not ignore without violating its own doctrine of total situational coherence. The response was immediate. Not visibly, not for the untrained eye, but Vale saw the command lattice tighten. Pulse verification frequencies rose. Correction intervals shortened. Distributed ship-state harmonics intensified across the formation. The fleet was pulling itself into sharper agreement, trying to resolve contradiction by increasing unity. Exactly as she had predicted, Rice watched the harmonics climb across the display. And that's what you wanted. That's what I needed. She gave the final sequence order. Across the outer system, industrial mass that had spent decades moving ore freight, scrap, and reactor skins in ugly silence was abruptly repurposed into a tactical geometry no human admiral had ever trained for, and no alien strategist had likely imagined. The disguised mass driver spines aligned to the hidden field regulators. Cargo trains became timing weights. Transfer cradles became vector anchors. Decommissioned launch scaffolds became resonance cages. Human infrastructure, civilian, military, obsolete, improvised, and borderline criminal in origin, briefly stopped being a collection of assets and became a single monstrous equation. Then the system fired. Not in a beam, not in a missile storm, not in any form the hostile fleet would have recognized as battle. The first impact happened inside the enemy command architecture. A rolling distortion struck the harmonized pulse lattice at a timing interval matched not to shield frequencies or weapon cycles, but to the fleet's own correction rhythm. It was less like hitting armor, and more like forcing a choir to hear itself a fraction of a second out of phase. Across the display, the alien formation shivered. Alignment bands flashed. Verification chains doubled back on themselves. Several ships executed simultaneous microcorrections in opposite directions as the coherence engine tried to determine which state was a true one. Quill stared. Did we just... Yes, Vale said. The second wave hit before the first could settle. This one came wrapped in mass. From disguised freight lanes and silent industrial rails, dense cargo slugs and stripped or packets accelerated through trajectories no military planner would have drafted cleanly because they had been built from logistics, not doctrine. They did not arrive as a disciplined barrage. They arrived as weaponized infrastructure, ungraceful, overdense, and horribly fast. The alien outer line reacted exactly as their systems had trained them to react. Too perfectly. Ships tightened shield conformity. Defensive harmonics synchronized. Correction pulses surged to maximum coherence. And in doing so, they amplified the very interference humanity had injected into the lattice. What had been a tactical exploit became a cascading contradiction. One cruiser drifted half a degree out of sacred alignment, then 3, then 12. A corrective pulse intended to restore order rippled through already corrupted state verification and produced the opposite result. Defensive spacing collapsed inward at one node and widened catastrophically at another. One of the Empire's luminous capital ships rotated to cover a phantom threat identified by missing command logic, exposing its flank to a freight mass strike that should never have existed in a civilized battlespace. The impact did not merely damage the vessel. It broke the illusion. Across the wall-sized tactical display, the invincible formation staggered. Alien ships, those impossible ordained shapes that had entered the system like a verdict, were no longer behaving as one will. Some held position, some overcorrected, some attempted doctrinal fallback patterns that no longer matched the state of neighboring units. A few even clipped one another with shield shear and engine wash as the command lattice fought itself in real time. No one in the chamber spoke. For one stretched, electrified moment, the whole room simply watched. Then Quill whispered, with the awe of someone hearing a mountain crack, "They're choking on her own perfection." Rice did not smile, but something colder and more dangerous entered his stillness. Follow through. Secondary mass launches rolled. More industrial vectors. More asymmetrical trajectories. Not enough to annihilate the fleet outright, not yet, but enough to keep feeding contradiction into a command culture that had mistaken universal obedience for universal resilience. On the alien side, several major elements began drifting out of ideal geometry. One vessel vented energy in a bloom too sudden to be intentional. Another cut shields entirely for a fraction of a second as overlapping defensive commands deadlocked. Humanity had not overpowered the Empire. It had made the Empire doubt its own hands. And with that, the emotional axis of the war snapped. All across human control channels, hidden observers and sealed command nodes saw proof of the impossible at nearly the same time. The enemy could stumble. The effect on morale was volcanic. Crews that had been loading machinery in funeral silence began shouting updates across encrypted channels. Engineering teams who had expected to die unknown on maintenance, scaffolds laughed in raw disbelief when the impact confirmations came back. Even in cities still choking on panic, rumors began to move faster than fear. The invaders were bleeding. The invaders could be hit. The invaders had not descended from heaven fully armored against consequence after all. For 90 seconds, humanity experienced something close to ecstasy. Then the midpoint twist arrived. A lower-tier intelligence officer, pale as paper, raised a trembling hand. "Admiral, we pulled something from the disrupted lattice." Rice didn't take his eyes off the battlefield. "What?" The officer's voice almost failed him. Permission to project. Granted. New data unfolded beside the battlefield. Deep routing paths extracted during the coherence rupture. System identifiers below the tactical layer. Long-range staging references. Administrative relays. Reserve synchronization branches. Vale crossed the room before anyone else fully grasped what they were seeing. Her eyes moved once across the structure. Then again. Then she stopped breathing for half a second. Mars saw her face and said, "What is it?" Vale answered without looking away. "This fleet isn't just a war asset." No one spoke. She expanded the routing map. The chamber watched as military traffic lines connected outward into things that should have been separate. Commercial corridors, colonial governance channels, doctrinal archive cores, border authority relays, tribute logistics, identity authentication chains. The enemy fleet's command architecture did not merely direct warships. It linked into the deeper operating logic of the Empire itself. Quill slowly said, their military network sits inside their civilization's nervous system. Vale nodded once. That's why the ritual matters so much, she said. Battlefield coherence isn't just a combat philosophy. It's their model of order, governance, expansion, legitimacy, obedience. They're all braided into the same architecture. Mar turned from the map to the crippled formation and finally understood the new scale of what had just happened. Oh, God. Rice looked at him. Say it. Mar's face had lost all color. If we can reach deeper through this breach, this isn't only a defensive opportunity. No one wanted to finish the sentence. Vale did. It's an Empire-level vulnerability. Silence. Then Quill, in a voice far too quiet for the size of the thought, asked the question that changed the war again. We can survive this battle, she said. But can we afford to stop there? That was the real shift. Until this moment, everything had been about survival, resistance, and buying the species one more day. But now, standing in the light of a crippled alien formation and a stolen glimpse into machinery of a galactic power, humanity found itself staring at something infinitely more dangerous than fear. Temptation. Not because conquest was noble, not because revenge was pure. Because history almost never offered a threatened species a second chance to seize the throat of the thing that had come to chain it. Rice felt the room turning around that realization, each person arriving at it differently and all of them hating themselves a little for how quickly the thought took root. Mar found his voice first. No, Vale did not turn from the map. You haven't heard the options. I don't need to. We took our opening. We defend, regroup, negotiate from strength if we can, and pray this is enough. Vale finally looked at him. It won't be. Because you say so? Because if this fleet survives long enough to report what just happened, the next wave won't make the same assumptions. We're inside their blind spot exactly once. Rice said nothing. That was what scared Mar most. A fresh cascade of battlefield updates scrolled over the tactical wall. Enemy coherence remained fractured. Secondary launches were still landing. Human casualties had not yet spiked. For the first time since first contact, the invaders were reacting instead of prescribing reality. And somehow that made the future feel less safe, not more. The intelligence officer cleared his throat. There's more, Admiral. Rice looked over. The officer enlarged one final extraction from the breach. A set of dormant routing permissions tied to deeper command tiers far beyond the local fleet. Reserve mobilization branches. Strategic synchronization keys. Staging references. Civilizational control pathways. Paths humanity should not have been able to see. Paths that would vanish as soon as the enemy command lattice stabilized. Vale's voice dropped to almost nothing. If we move now, she said, we may be able to breach whatever sits above this fleet in the chain. Mar took one step back as if the room itself had become unstable. Rice looked from the battle projection to the stolen routes, then the faces around him. Terror, vindication, hunger, disbelief, moral recoil, and that oldest of all dangerous human instincts, the urge not merely to survive the monster, but to make sure it never stands up again. Outside the vault, humanity was still cheering its first impossible victory. Inside, the people who would decide what that victory meant were staring at a choice far more intoxicating than defense. The species had wanted only to live. Now it had a glimpse of how to rewrite the map. And the war was no longer about whether humanity could endure the blow. It was about whether humanity would stop with that. Victory lasted 11 minutes. Not on the battlefield. There, the disruption still held. Alien formation geometry remained wounded. Command harmonics still buckling under contradictions humanity had rammed into their sacred coherence. Secondary freight mass strikes were landing. Several hostile capital elements had gone dark. For the first time in recorded human history, an extraterrestrial force that had introduced itself as inevitable was being forced to improvise in front of witnesses. But inside the Callisto vault, Victory as a feeling had a shorter lifespan, because once the shouting on encrypted channels died down and the adrenaline settled into analysis, the implications became impossible to ignore. Humanity had not merely bloodied a superior fleet. It had discovered that the fleet was attached to something far larger than local war-making. The breach in the command lattice had exposed strands reaching outward into reserve mobilization, colonial administration, interstellar identity verification, transit priority, tribute accounting, border regulation, systems so deeply woven together that no clean line existed between military command and imperial existence. The invaders had not separated force from legitimacy because, after enough centuries of unchallenged supremacy, they no longer needed to, which meant that if humanity wanted to do more than survive the current assault, it had one narrow, intoxicating chance to strike deeper. That was the argument consuming the chamber now. Chancellor Elian Mar stood at the end of the analog planning table, one hand braced against the edge as though the room's gravity had subtly increased. "No," he said again. He had been saying it in different tones for the last 9 minutes. Furious, disbelieving, exhausted, almost pleading, but all versions meant the same thing. No to escalation. No to transforming a desperate defense into an offensive doctrine. No to turning a lucky asymmetric exploit into the foundation of a species-level gamble. On the opposite side of the table, Sarah Vale no longer looked like someone arguing policy. She looked like someone trying to keep a narrowing window from closing, while other people debated the morality of using hinges. "This is not mission drift," she said. "This is mission consequence." Mar gave a short, incredulous laugh. "That is the kind of sentence people invent right before they burn half a civilization down in the name of historical necessity." Vale did not flinch. "And that is the kind of sentence people use right before they hand the future back to an enemy, because they're too frightened by what leverage feels like." "Enough," Rice said. The room obeyed him instantly. That, more than anything else, was what frightened him. The longer the crisis ran, the more authority collapsed toward whoever sounded least uncertain, regardless of whether certainty was deserved. It was one of the oldest pathologies in war, pressure turning leadership into gravity. He knew that. He also knew he was already benefiting from it, which meant he had less margin for self-deception than anyone else in the chamber. He turned toward the projections. The local tactical picture remained favorable for now. The alien armada was still trying to reassert doctrinal coherence, while human infrastructure strikes kept forcing contradictory state corrections. But the deeper extraction from the disrupted lattice showed instability everywhere else as well. Distant branch systems pinging for command confirmation, reserve handshake failures, transit authority delays, administrative nodes requesting doctrinal authentication from channels now half-blind. Humanity had touched the Empire's nervous system. Only touched it, and already the body was twitching. Commander Imani broke the silence first. "If we let the breach collapse," she said, "what's the most likely outcome?" Vale answered immediately. "The fleet regains enough coherence to retreat, report, and trigger an adaptive response from higher command." "How adaptive?" Vale looked toward the extracted routes. "Enough." That was the honest answer, and everyone knew it. The first battle had worked because the enemy had mistaken human behavior for lower-order noise. The next wave would not. If this fleet escaped with a clean understanding of what had happened, humanity would lose the only advantage it had, surprise born from being doctrinally illegible. Mar rubbed both hands over his mouth. "So your position is that our choices are gamble now or die later." "My position," Vale said, "is that later becomes unwinnable faster than you're emotionally prepared to accept." Rice studied her face. For all her severity, all her cutting intelligence, there was no triumph in her now, no thrill, no hidden appetite for destruction. That would have been easier to manage, easier to dismiss. What he saw instead was something much more difficult: conviction under mathematical pressure. She was not hungry for escalation. She simply believed the numbers had already escalated, whether the room admitted it or not. He hated that he might agree. "Show me the path," he said. Mars stared at him. "Jonas." "Show me." Vale moved at once. A new model unfolded across the table. Not a fleet maneuver, but a systems attack. The local battlefield remained only the anchoring distraction. The real opportunity lay inside the temporary access routes extracted from the enemy lattice. If human code, signal architecture, and stolen harmonic templates could be fused fast enough, they could push a contradictory command package upstream, not toward ship weapons, but toward the Empire's coherence grid itself. The goal was not to hack a fleet. It was to poison certainty. Quill squinted at the model. You want to feed their higher architecture mutually exclusive priorities, not random contradictions. Vale said, structured ones, orders that all validate locally but fail globally, military movement authorizations that conflict with transit sanctity, emergency reserve mobilization that invalidates doctrinal rank sequencing, border defense triggers that collide with tribute corridors. We don't crash the system by shouting nonsense. We crash it by making too much sanctioned sense at once. One of the cyber warfare officers actually laughed once in raw disbelief. Mar looked sick. That's not a battlefield plan. That's administrative nerve gas. Vale turned to him. Yes. The simplicity of it drained the remaining color from his face. Rice kept reading the projection. The method required 3 conditions. First, maintain local pressure on the visible fleet long enough to preserve the breach. Second, route a hybrid signal package using the Empire's own command grammar, which meant integrating alien harmonic structures with human recursion engines and improvisational code that could evolve faster than the coherence grid could quarantine. Third, physically insert the package through a deeper relay path that did not currently exist inside human-controlled space. That last requirement was the worst one. Quill saw it too. We don't have a relay close enough. Vale tapped a route line cutting through a region of space beyond the main combat geometry, a debris-rich gravitational seam around an old dark mass survey corridor, considered useless by conventional naval doctrine because the field distortion made stable fleet movement inefficient and line-of-sight targeting ugly. To humans, it was not useless. It was unappealing, which was close enough. We seed the packet through a relay chain built on stolen harmonics and local mass shadowing. Vale said, we move a covert insertion team through the seam, attached to one of the enemy's lower verification trunks, and push the contradiction package from inside their own architecture. Mar blinked at her. You want to board their nervous system? Yes. Using what? Everything we have that they would call beneath dignity. That meant salvage stealth plates, freight hull masking, improvised signal nests, civilian survey drones repurposed as packet mirrors, and a physical infiltration unit, carrying hybrid code nobody in the room could honestly guarantee would behave once released into a command structure this old and this doctrinally rigid. It was madness. It was also the first plan anyone had presented that sounded more dangerous to the Empire than to humanity. That was the problem. Danger seduced. Rice knew that too. He forced himself to ask the next question anyway. Cost. No one answered immediately. Then Quill did, because she always respected a wound more when it was measured before inflicted. Hi, she said. Maybe catastrophic on the insertion side. The seam is unstable. We're building the relay path under hostile observation, and once the packet starts propagating, every defensive routine they have is going to notice something is wrong. The team likely does not come back. Mar let out a low sound. Likely? Quill looked at him, and for the first time there was no hardness in her voice at all. No, they don't. The room took that in, not as theory, as assignment. Rice's gaze moved to the list of possible insertion assets. Most were machines. A few were people. All of them had names attached somewhere deeper in the system. Then another feed broke across the wall. Aster 9. The partial evacuation was still underway, controlled, silent on public bands, but not invisible to those inside. Pressure had started building. Rumors moved faster than orderly relocation. Families were asking why med priority sectors were being moved first, why cargo shuttles were leaving half full, why outer ring compartments were losing access to general transit corridors. Security teams were still containing it. For now, Mar saw the feed and nearly laughed from exhaustion. There's your cost. You're already balancing this whole strategy on people who don't even know they're standing on it. Vale's face tightened for the first time. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated. the look of a person who has accepted the immoral shape of necessity, but not the human texture of it. "We move them if we can," she said. "If," Mar snapped. Rice cut in before the argument hardened beyond repair. Status on Aster 9 conversion. Quill checked. Threshold in 52 minutes. How many clear? 6,084. Not enough. Not close. The room went silent again. Then a new voice entered it, crisp and young and far too controlled. "Admiral, you need to see this." It came from a signals analyst at lower tier, one of the reserve officers attached to Deep Pattern Review. She patched through a live reconstruction from the enemy side. Not direct visual, but telemetry inference strong enough to model command behavior inside one of the surviving alien capital elements. Something had changed. The Empire was adapting, not institutionally. Not yet, but personally. A surviving command node had stopped trying to fully restore doctrinal harmony. Instead, it was rerouting local authority into tighter, more compartmentalized channels, reducing the very coherence density humanity was exploiting. It was crude by imperial standards, inefficient, almost ugly, and therefore more dangerous. Vale went very still. "That's new." Rice felt the room tilt. "Can they do it across the fleet?" "Not fast enough to save this battle," Vale said. "But if whoever's issuing that adaptation survives, they'll understand us better than the others." Mar whispered. "So now there's someone on their side learning too." "Yes," Vale said. That was the part nobody had fully accounted for. Humanity was not the only species capable of surprise under pressure. The Empire as a whole might be doctrinally ancient, but individuals inside it could still evolve if terrified hard enough, which meant the window was closing faster than even Vale's harshest projections had assumed. Rice made the call. "Prepare the insertion." Mar looked at him with something almost like betrayal. "You're deciding already?" "No. I'm refusing to waste the option while we argue. That is deciding." "Yes," Rice said. "It is." For a long moment, the Chancellor simply stared at him, perhaps seeing at last that the line between civilian governance and wartime command had not merely blurred. It had ruptured. Then Mar did something no one expected. He stepped to the table, looked directly at the system's attack model, and said, "If you do this, and it works, you do not get a cleaner galaxy. You understand that, yes?" Nobody answered. So he continued, "You destabilize logistics, border authority, command legitimacy, resource distribution, half the things holding their civilization together. The Empire won't just bleed. It may fracture. Worlds will seize openings. Provincial militaries will defect. Subject populations may revolt. Refugee floods, famine corridors, resource wars. You are not simply killing an invasion. You're creating a power vacuum measured in star systems." Vale met his eyes. "Yes." Mar looked to Rice. "And you are willing to own that?" Rice stared at the battle display, at Aster 9, at the insertion route, at the adaptive alien command node narrowing humanity's time to exploit ignorance. He answered with the only honesty left to him. "No," he said. "I'm willing to do it anyway." No one in the chamber mistook that for confidence. It was worse. It was responsibility without innocence. Orders moved. The insertion package began taking shape. Hybrid code cores, harmonic translators, mass signal nests, relay drones, improvised hull sheathing, vacuum assault crew drawn from units already written off as deniable if caught. Out in the gravitational seam, small human craft slipped away from a visible battle under the cover of debris, radiation scatter, and assumptions the enemy had not yet learned to stop making. On the main tactical wall, the alien adaptation spread another fraction. Localized command pockets began decoupling from the central harmony state. The Empire, at least one mind within it, was becoming less elegant, more flexible, more human. Vale watched it with a kind of grim fascination. "They're learning the wrong lesson," she murmured. Quill glanced at her. "There's a right one?" Vale's eyes never left the display. The right lesson would have been fear. That sentence stayed in Rice's head long after she said it, because it cut to the center of the entire war. If the Empire learned fear, it might retreat into caution, preserve its hierarchy, and come back later with better answers. If it learned adaptation, then humanity had just woken a rival species from the sleep of victory and taught it how to hunt in uncertainty. The insertion team launched 12 minutes later. No speeches, no final words broadcast over command, just transponder lights disappearing into the seam one by one, swallowed by Rex shadow and gravitational noise. As they vanished, the lower-tier analyst tracking the adaptive alien node suddenly went rigid. "Admiral." Rice turned. "What now?" She looked up, face pale. "It's not just one command element anymore." "How many?" Her fingers moved over the display, isolating a second pocket of decentralized behavior. Then a third, not fleet-wide, not yet, but spreading. The thing humanity had counted on, that the Empire's greatest strength was also its cage, was beginning to erode in real time. Rice felt the pressure spike through the room, like a physical force. Vale saw it too. For the first time since the crisis began, something like urgency broke through her cold precision. "We are out of theory time," she said. And no one in the chamber had to ask what she meant. If the strike worked, humanity might break an empire. If it failed, humanity would have taught the Empire how to become dangerous in exactly the way humanity was. The insertion team crossed into the scene without sound, which was fitting, because by then the war had moved beyond anything sound could help, far from a visible battle line, beyond the bright geometry of the wounded alien fleet and the looping freight mass strikes that still kept portions of its command structure off balance. The seam looked less like navigable space and more like an old wound in gravity. Dark survey debris drifted through shearing vectors. Fractured mineral clouds flashed with weak electrostatic discharge. Gravitational distortions bent light, just enough to make distance lie. It was the kind of place no elegant military doctrine would choose for precision maneuver, which was exactly why humanity had. In the Callisto Vault, every display that mattered had been stripped down to essentials. No decorative overlays. No morale channels. No public feeds. Only 3 operational layers remained. The local fleet battle, where human pressure still had to look chaotic enough to preserve the original breach. The insertion route, where a small team carrying a hybrid contradiction package was threading a path through broken gravity toward one of the Empire's lower verification trunks. And the deeper architecture map, where stolen command pathways pulsed in fading windows that might close forever if the enemy finished adapting before humanity finished reaching. Admiral Jonas Rice stood between all 3, as if posture alone could hold them together. Commander Imani could track the insertion with surgical focus. Team crossing marker 4. Signal blue minimal. Relay drone stable. Across the table, Chancellor Elian Marr said nothing. He had moved past argument hours ago. Now he watched in the exhausted silence a man who had finally understood that moral objection and practical complicity could coexist in the same body without canceling each other out. He still believed this course might poison the future. He still believed history, if humanity retained the luxury of history, would judge the people in this room harshly. But he had stopped trying to prevent the strike, not because he approved, because the adaptive enemy nodes on the tactical wall had made the alternative too visible. They were spreading, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, across the damaged alien formation. More command elements were beginning to shed centralized coherence in favor of local initiative. It was ugly by Imperial standards, inefficient, fragmented, the kind of battlefield decentralization their own doctrine had once treated as lower-order contamination. And yet it was working. Where the first break in their command harmony had caused hesitation, some of the newer decentralized pockets were now surviving contradiction by simply acting before perfect alignment could be restored. Human mass strikes still hurt them, still broke ships, still forced errors, but no longer with the same catastrophic elegance as before. Sarah Vale watched the adaptation spread and seemed, for the first time since first contact, genuinely angry. Not loud anger, not theatrical anger, the colder kind that surfaced when a mind recognized the shape of a danger it had hoped would remain dormant. "They're metabolizing the shock," she said. Rice looked at the screen. "Can they recover the fleet?" "Not fully. Not in time." "Then what am I supposed to be afraid of?" Vale turned toward him, and in her face he saw the answer before she spoke it. that they survived this battle for the right reason. The room went still. She stepped toward the deep architecture map and pulled up a live comparison between the original Imperial command state and the new pockets of local deviation. At first, she said, their system assumed contradiction had to be resolved by increasing coherence. That's why the exploit worked so violently. But now at least one strategist inside that fleet has understood the actual threat. Not force, not mass, not even asymmetry. Her finger moved across the branching command pockets. Learning velocity. Mars' voice was dry as dust. And now they're trying to match ours. Yes, no one liked the simplicity of that. Humanity had spent centuries making a religion of adaptation because reality had never let it settle into anything gentler. But if the Empire learned the same lesson under pressure, then the current advantage was not merely temporary. It was self-erasing. The more effectively humanity frightened its enemy, the more intelligently that enemy might return, which meant the insertion strike was no longer just an opportunity. It was a last chance to make adaptation itself too expensive. A fresh signal pulsed from the seam cut across the room. Quill straightened. Insertion team approaching trunk shadow. The verification trunks sat half buried inside the Empire's lower command architecture, routed through a support relay cluster that would have looked insignificant to any strategist still thinking in fleets. That was why Vale had chosen it. Big enough to touch the coherence backbone. Small enough that local assumptions might still treat it as secure by obscurity. If the team reached it, they could seed the contradiction package directly into the Empire's internal logic. If they failed, humanity would not get another attempt. The display flickered through relay camera feeds, grainy hull shadow images, instrument readouts, thermal traces barely distinguishable from debris noise. Then a helmet audio burst came through, thin and clipped. In position, said the insertion lead. No name, no extra words. Black authorization had shaved identity out of the mission until only function remained. Vale leaned toward the console. Confirmed trunk's signature. A pause. Then, confirmed. Harmonic profile matches extraction band. We can attach. Rice listened to the voice and tried, unsuccessfully, not to imagine the person inside it. To command at scale was to live inside abstraction. To remain human while doing it was to occasionally fail at that. Proceed, he said. The attachment sequence began. On the deep architecture map, a thin human-made line extended toward the Imperial verification trunk like a needle moving toward a spinal column. The hybrid package behind it was not elegant. Human code rarely was, especially under time pressure. It had been built from stolen harmonic templates, recursive civilian prediction engines, military intrusion architecture, freight routing logic, emergency voting conflict models, and 3 black budget systems so ethically dubious that nobody in the room had asked for their original use cases. It was not a weapon the Empire would recognize. That was the point. Quill monitored local battle pressure as the insertion advanced. We're losing exploit efficiency on the main front. Decentralized enemy pockets now at 19% of surviving command nodes. Hold them disordered. Rice said, we are. No. Vale cut in. Not disordered. Overcommit. Quill frowned. Difference. If they feel cornered, local initiative spreads faster. We need them believing they can still restore control if they just commit harder. Rice saw it at once. Feed their optimism. A brutal phrase. An accurate one. The local human assault pattern shifted immediately. Freight mass launches became more selective. Visible pressure eased at 2 sections of the alien line, while intensify at one doctrinally symbolic axis. The message was subtle but legible to any enemy commander still thinking imperially. Not collapse, not rout, but wounded battle that disciplined leadership might yet salvage. It worked. The adaptive pockets did not retreat. They leaned in. On the tactical wall, damaged alien command elements began drawing tighter around the symbolic center of the formation, trying to rebuild legitimacy through visible control. In doing so, they increased dependency on exactly the shared architecture humanity was about to poison. Vale watched the pattern form and whispered, almost to herself, "There you are." Mar heard her. "You sound relieved." "I'm not relieved," she said. "I'm accurate." The attachment line hit the trunk. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the deep architecture map bloomed. Human signal entered Imperial verification space. Every person in the chamber stopped breathing at once. The contradiction package unfolded not as an obvious intrusion, but as a set of internally valid command-state relationships. Border verification updates tied to reserve mobilization. Transit sanctity exceptions tied to doctrinal emergency precedents. Military correction authorities cross-signed with civic continuity protections. Colonial compliance escalations that invalidated the same command hierarchies they depended on. Each element alone looked plausible. Together, they formed a logic knot. The Empire's coherent system accepted the first layer, then the second, then began to process the third. Quill stared at the propagation branches. It's in. Across the map, Imperial pathways lit up. Not explosively. Worse than that, systemically. Verification trees began requesting priority arbitration from parent nodes already saturated with conflicting authority states. Reserve channels sought legitimacy from doctrinal centers temporarily overruled by transit protection clauses. Border relays froze. Strategic synchronization branches requeried themselves. Administration, command, logistics, legitimacy, all the braided systems of an old empire, started asking the same question in too many places at once. Which truth outranks the others? And for the first time in perhaps millennia, the Empire had no immediate answer. The local fleet felt it first. On the tactical wall, alien command pockets that had been adapting with alarming intelligence suddenly stuttered. Local initiative did not vanish, but it lost clean access to the symbolic architecture that made it authoritative. Some ships pushed forward under old assumptions. Others checked for revised doctrine and found conflicting states. Several attempted to rejoin central coherence only to discover the coherence backbone had become a labyrinth of sanctioned contradiction. Humanity had not destroyed their weapons. It had made obedience expensive. Mar looked up at the spreading architecture collapse with horror and wonder mixing into the same expression. How far does that go? Vale answered without triumph. Farther than anyone here should feel comfortable with. As if summoned by that sentence, fresh reports began spilling in from the deeper extraction branches. Imperial administrative hubs delaying strategic traffic. Outer colonial sectors requesting emergency clarification. Reserve mobilization nodes freezing under mutually validated claims. Tribute corridor authorities denying military precedents. Civil order branches invoking continuity, protections against wartime override. The contradiction package was not just cracking a fleet. It was pulling stress through the Empire's model of itself. For one blazing minute, it looked like total success. Then the enemy changed again. A new command behavior appeared at the center of the propagation map. Harsh, brutal, doctrinally unclean. Instead of resolving contradictions through arbitration, an Imperial strategist began severing contaminated branches wholesale. No appeals, no harmonization, no ceremonial legitimacy restoration. Entire pathways were being cut away to preserve local function. Administrative nodes quarantined, civic branches amputated, transit authority bypassed, lower governance protections discarded. Mar blinked. What were they doing? Vale's face went still. The one who adapted before, she said. They've stopped trying to save the system beautifully. The implication hit everyone at once. The Empire was becoming uglier to survive, more ruthless, more selective, more willing to sacrifice its own order to preserve its capacity for war. In another life, in another century, humanity might have admired that. Here now it was terrifying. Could track the damage in real time. Propagation slowing. How much? Rice asked. Not enough yet to save them. Too much to ignore. The insertion lead's voice burst back over the line. Sharper this time. Trunk resistance escalating. We've been flagged. At once, the seam display filled with new signatures. Enemy counter-intrusion sweep. Localized point defense activation. Verification trunk isolation shutters beginning to close. The insertion team had gone from invisible to hunted in seconds. Can they pull free? Mar asked. A brutal phrase. An accurate one. The local human assault pattern shifted immediately. Freight mass launches became more selective. Visible pressure eased at 2 sections of the alien line, while intensifying at one doctrinally symbolic axis. The message was subtle but legible to any enemy commander still thinking imperially. Not collapse, not rout, but a wounded battle that disciplined leadership might yet salvage. It worked. The adaptive pockets did not retreat. They leaned in, on the tactical wall. Damaged alien command elements began drawing tighter around the symbolic center of the formation, trying to rebuild legitimacy through visible control. In doing so, they increased dependency on exactly the shared architecture humanity was about to poison. Vale watched the pattern form and whispered, almost to herself, "There you are." Mar heard her. "You sound relieved." "I'm not relieved," she said. "I'm accurate." The attachment line hit the trunk. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the deep architecture map bloomed. Human signal entered Imperial verification space. Every person in the chamber stopped breathing at once. The contradiction package unfolded not as an obvious intrusion, but as a set of internally valid command-state relationships. Border verification updates tied to reserve mobilization. Transit sanctity exceptions tied to doctrinal emergency precedents. Military correction authorities cross-signed with civic continuity protections. Colonial compliance escalations that invalidated the same command hierarchies they depended on. Each element alone looked plausible. Together, they formed a logic knot. The Empire's coherent system accepted the first layer, then the second, then began to process the third. Quill stared at the propagation branches. "It's in." Across the map, Imperial pathways lit up. Not explosively. Worse than that. Systemically. Verification trees began requesting priority arbitration from parent nodes already saturated with conflicting authority states. Reserve channels sought legitimacy from doctrinal centers temporarily overruled by transit protection clauses. Border relays froze. Strategic synchronization branches requeried themselves. Administration, command, logistics, legitimacy, all the braided systems of an old empire, started asking the same question in too many places at once. Which truth outranks the others? And for the first time in perhaps millennia, the Empire had no immediate answer. The local fleet felt it first. On the tactical wall, alien command pockets that had been adapting with alarming intelligence suddenly stuttered. Local initiative did not vanish, but it lost clean access to symbolic architecture that made it authoritative. Some ships pushed forward under old assumptions. Others checked for revised doctrine and found conflicting states. Several attempted to rejoin central coherence only to discover the coherence backbone had become a labyrinth of sanctioned contradiction. Humanity had not destroyed their weapons. It had made obedience expensive. Mar looked up at the spreading architecture collapse with horror and wonder mixing into the same expression. How far does that go? Vale answered without triumph. Farther than anyone here should feel comfortable with. As if summoned by that sentence, fresh reports began spilling in from the deeper extraction branches. Imperial administrative hubs delaying strategic traffic. Outer colonial sectors requesting emergency clarification. Reserve mobilization nodes freezing under mutually validated claims. Tribute corridor authorities denying military precedents. Civil order branches invoking continuity. Protections against wartime override. The contradiction package was not just cracking a fleet. It was pulling stress through the Empire's model of itself. For one blazing minute, it looked like total success. Then the enemy changed again. A new command behavior appeared at the center of the propagation map. Harsh, brutal, doctrinally unclean. Instead of resolving contradictions through arbitration, an Imperial strategist began severing contaminated branches wholesale. No appeals, no harmonization, no ceremonial legitimacy restoration. Entire pathways were being cut away to preserve local function. Administrative nodes quarantined. Civic branches amputated. Transit authority bypassed. Lower governance protections discarded. Mar blinked. What are they doing? Vale's face went still. The one who adapted before, she said. They've stopped trying to save the system beautifully. The implication hit everyone at once. The Empire was becoming uglier to survive. More ruthless. More selective. more willing to sacrifice its own order to preserve its capacity for war. In another life, in another century, humanity might have admired that. Here, now it was terrifying. Could track the damage in real time. Propagation slowing. How much? Rice asked. Not enough yet to save them. Too much to ignore. The insertion lead's voice burst back over the line, sharper this time. Trunk resistance escalating. We've been flagged. At once, the scene display filled with new signatures. Enemy counter-intrusion sweep. Localized point defense activation. Verification trunk isolation shutters beginning to close. The insertion team had gone from invisible to hunted in seconds. Can they pull free? Mar asked. Quill didn't answer. She didn't need to. Vale stepped toward the console. Pushed the buried layer. Rice turned. What buried layer? No one else in the room looked surprised enough. That told him everything he needed to know. The blood seemed to drain from the edges of the chamber. Vale met his stare without apology. The contradiction package has a final cascade state. It wasn't the main briefing, because if I said it too early, this room would waste 40 minutes debating whether history has a right to exist after this. Mar actually recoiled. You conceal part of the strike? I concealed the only part that still matters if they adapt in time. Rice's voice hardened to something dangerous. Explain. Now. Vale touched the map. A second architecture bloomed beneath the first, deeper, more concentrated, tied not to distributed command verification, but to the Empire's coherence core itself, the symbolic technical layer where doctrinal legitimacy, strategic synchronization, and identity, hierarchy converged. If the adaptive strategists keep severing contaminated branches, she said, they can preserve enough war function to contain the fracture. Mar was already shaking his head. No. So the buried layer targets the core. Quill looked at the projection and went pale. That's not a quarantine event. That's a collapse event. Yes. Rice felt the room narrow around him. What happens if we trigger it? Vale did not look away. The coherence core fails faster than they can amputate around it. Strategic authority fractures. Fleet synchronization falls into regional interpretation. Administrative legitimacy breaks with it. Mar's voice cracked. Across how much of the Empire? I don't know. That was the worst answer of all, because it was honest, not a controlled military victory, not a negotiated deterrent, a civilizational break. The local tactical wall flashed with new data, as if trying to force decision through momentum. Adaptive enemy nodes were recovering partial function. The insertion team was under direct attack. The contradiction package was still propagating, but no longer fast enough to guarantee permanent damage before containment stabilized. Humanity stood on the edge of a win, and on the edge of creating something worse than the force that had threatened it. Mar looked at Rice with undisguised disbelief. You could not authorize that. Quill said nothing, but her silence carried its own plea. Vale's voice came low and sharp. If we don't, they survive smart. That was the phrase that stayed in the air. Not survive. Survive smart. The Empire had already learned more in these hours than it had probably needed to in centuries. If it carried that lesson home, if it rebuilt around adaptation instead of ceremony, humanity would never again face the complacent arrogance that had made this chance possible. Rice looked at the seam feed. The insertion team was still alive, barely. He looked at the local battle. Alien initiative was returning in fragments. He looked at Aster 9, still evacuating, still not empty, still part of the machine that had made this possible. Then he looked at the coherence core collapse model veil, had hidden until now. He saw, all at once, every version of the future layered over one another. A frightened humanity that stopped now and faced a smarter empire later. A victorious humanity that saved itself by shattering a civilization it did not understand. A galaxy waking tomorrow not under one arrogant order, but under 1,000 fires. There are moments when command ceases to be strategy and becomes authorship. He had reached one. His voice, when it came, was almost calm. Transmit authorization. Mar took one stunned step toward him. Jonas. But the order was already moving. The buried layer unlocked. No one in the chamber yet knew whether they had just chosen salvation, supremacy, or catastrophe. only that the final line had been crossed. And somewhere deep inside the Empire's wounded nervous system, something essential had just been told to fall apart. The buried layer did not detonate. It unraveled. That was the first thing Admiral Jonas Rice understood as a coherence core cascade entered the Empire's deeper architecture. No explosion rippled across the tactical wall. No catastrophic bloom announced itself in a single glorious instant. The Empire did not fall apart like a structure hit by force. It came apart like certainty, discovering it had too many definitions. Inside the Callisto Vault, the projections changed texture before they changed shape. Command pathways that had once flowed in clean, luminous bands began splitting into branching disputes. Synchronization channels did not simply go dark. They reclassified one another. Strategic priority trees stopped agreeing on who had authority to rank urgency. Identity hierarchies that once authenticated command legitimacy across fleets and colonies now returned nested contradiction loops, each level validating itself while destabilizing the level above it. The coherence core had not merely been attacked. It had been forced to doubt its own right to arbitrate reality. And for an empire that had spent ages turning obedience into a civilizational reflex, doubt was more lethal than bombardment. Commander Imani Quill watched the propagation map turn from orderly architecture into a spreading field of contested authority. Core synchronization failing across branch sectors. How far? Chancellor Eliamar asked, though the answer was already visible in his face. Farther than he had prayed, farther than he had feared. Quill checked the range expansion overlays. Military first, then administrative, then transit protection. Colonial governance handshakes are fragmenting behind them. Mark closed his eyes. The words he had used hours earlier, power vacuum measured in star systems, were no longer warning. They were forecast. On the local tactical wall, the effect was immediate and savage. The surviving alien fleet, already destabilized by the contradiction package and the human infrastructure strikes that had opened the breach, suddenly lost the ability to appeal to a higher certainty. Decentralized pockets that had been adapting with terrifying speed now found themselves cut loose from the symbolic architecture that made their local authority meaningful. Some commanders pushed for autonomy. Others attempted emergency restoration of doctrinal chain. Some ships treated severed coherence as contamination and withdrew into defensive stasis. Others interpreted the same collapse as authorization for independent retaliation. The result was not elegant defeat. It was implosion by interpretation. One cluster of enemy vessels broke hard starboard, trying to preserve a surviving command carrier, as if legitimacy could still be anchored in visible form. Another cluster pivoted the opposite direction to protect what its own damaged hierarchy now classified as priority sanctum assets. Two major elements, each operating under internally valid but mutually exclusive emergency doctrine. Cross-firing lines. Shield harmonics flared. Positional authority failed. Defensive geometry turned cannibalistic. The Empire had arrived in human space as a single will. Now it could not agree on what will meant. Rice stood motionless, watching it happen, and felt no triumph. Only scale. This was larger than battle, larger than revenge, larger, perhaps, than the human species had any right to touch with improvisation and fear and a few terrible insights harvested under existential pressure. Local victory is locked, Quill said, her voice thinner than usual. They can't stabilize in time. No one cheered. Not in the vault. Elsewhere, across encrypted channels and hidden command bands, humanity was almost certainly erupting. Crews in the outer yards would be shouting over one another. Exhausted engineers would be laughing like people who looked directly at extinction and found something breakable instead. The rumor chains flooding Earth, Luna, Mars, and the Belt would already be outrunning censorship. The invaders were falling. The impossible was happening. The gods could bleed. The fleet above human space had broken. But inside the room where the next century had just been rewritten, celebration had nowhere clean to stand. A signal flare from the seam snapped everyone's attention toward the insertion display. The team's relay feed was fragmenting. Enemy countermeasures had reached the verification trunk at last. Point defense blooms chewed through debris shadow. The attached signal nest was still transmitting, but now in irregular bursts. Hull pressure alerts. Thermal spikes. Pulse interference thick enough to turn the visual feed into shuddering gray static. Then the insertion lead's voice came through, stripped almost all the way down to breath and discipline. Cascade confirmed. A pause. Then quieter. Core took it. Quill leaned in. Can you detach? Silence. Then weapons glare flooded half the feed. When the voice returned, it was so calm it hurt to hear. Negative. Nobody in the chamber spoke. Mar looked away first. Rice did not. He remained facing the display as the last fragments of the insertion team's signal dissolved into static and radiation bloom. There would be no dramatic final words, no grand patriotic speech. They had not died in the kind of war culture liked to remember. They had disappeared inside an enemy nervous system carrying a piece of history sharp enough to cut an empire open from the inside. Humanity would probably mythologize them later. That would not make the loss cleaner. Vale watched the dead signal for a long second, then forced herself back to the propagation map. That was who she was. Not unfeeling. Functional. And Rice finally understood that the difference mattered. What do we look like beyond the local collapse? He asked. Vale expanded the galactic branches they had reached through stolen command pathways. The image that formed across the wall was not a conqueror's map. It was a wound map. Imperial sectors blinking uncertain. Border regions flashing authority disputes. Reserve formation stalled by contradictory mobilization credentials. Colonial governance nodes split between doctrinal allegiance and emergent local continuity protocols. Tribute routes freezing as civil and military priority systems invalidated one another. Regions that had likely known one unquestioned chain of legitimacy for longer than human recorded history were now encountering the political equivalent of decompression. Mar stared at it with grief and fury braided together. We did this. No one corrected him, because they had. Not alone. The Empire had built the fragility by welding too much of itself to one model of order. The invaders had initiated the threat, demanded surrender, shortened the deadline, punished civilians, and taught humanity in the cruelest possible way that obedience was the future on offer. But still, the hand that pushed the last stone had been human. Vale spoke softly, and for once there was no hard edge in it at all. Yes. Mar turned to her. And was it worth it? That question was not really for her. It was for the room, for history, for the species, for the ghosts that had already begun accumulating around the plan the moment Rice ordered partial evacuation at Astor. 9 and kept ordering forward when every step made the next one morally harder. Vale looked at the collapsing architecture, then at the local battle, then finally at Mar. I think, she said, that if we hadn't done it, they would have come back understanding us. Mar's face tightened. That is not the same answer. No, Vale said. It isn't. And that was the final truth of it. There was no clean answer waiting behind victory. No version of events in which humanity remained innocent and survived untouched. The Empire had offered a choice between submission and annihilation, but reality, as always, had provided more brutal options than the ones announced aloud. On the tactical wall, the final organized resistance inside the alien fleet failed. A surviving command carrier attempted one last doctrinal reassertion, pulsing emergency legitimacy markers through a network that no longer trusted the idea of singular rank. Half its escort vessels responded. The other half interpreted the same signal as corrupted hierarchy and cut free. Human freight mass strikes reached the carrier seconds later, punching through shields no longer harmonized to a common command state. The vessel did not explode magnificently. It simply lost shape, breaking apart under impacts it might once have absorbed without incident. The rest of the formation dissolved by degrees after that. Some alien ships fled on partial drives, punching blind exits out of the battle space under local authority their civilization might later refuse to recognize. Some surrender by powering down and broadcasting continuity, please, in fractured command syntax. Some drifted in defensive lock, still waiting for clarity from a core that no longer existed in the form they had known. The war's opening era ended not with final shot, but with a visible death of inevitability. Humanity had lived. More than that, humanity had forced the galaxy's oldest visible superpower to discover that its perfection had limits. And more than that, Though no one in the vault was yet willing to say it aloud, humanity had become something new in the same instant. Not a hidden species on the edge of larger maps. Not an underdog begging a future to spare it. A center of gravity. An unpredictable one. That distinction mattered, because conquest would have been simpler to understand. Crown the victor. Replace one hierarchy with another. Pretend war had an ending neat enough for ceremony. But Rice knew, standing before the wound map of the collapsing empire, that humanity was not walking into a throne room. It was walking into an aftermath. Former subject worlds would feel the fracture and test their chains. Provincial fleets would decide whether loyalty still had meaning when legitimacy itself had split. Trade routes would harden into fronts. Refugee columns would move through systems whose authorities now contradicted one another by law, doctrine, or pure desperation. Opportunists would rise. Old hatreds would find oxygen. Border violence would spread where imperial certainty had once frozen conflict in place by sheer weight. Humanity had not inherited a galaxy. It had destabilized one. The realization settled through the vault one person at a time. Quill was first to phrase it. "We didn't end the danger," she said quietly. "We redistributed it." Mar let out a breath that sounded almost like defeat. Across the stars. Rice looked at the ruined local fleet. "Yes," he said, "and now every surviving power will study us the way we studied them." That was the final status reversal. The Empire had once treated humanity as a contaminant, a species too chaotic to deserve sovereign motion through the stars. Now the galaxy, whatever remained coherent enough to call itself one, would look toward the human systems and see the same thing the Empire saw too late. Not primitive, not civilized by old standards. Adaptive under pressure to a degree that bordered on predatory, willing to salvage, improvise, infiltrate, contaminate, and escalate faster than cleaner powers found comfortable. Humanity had survived first contact. Humanity had broken the Empire's opening hand, and in doing so, it had told the stars exactly what kind of force had just entered their history. On one of the lower-tier feeds, a delayed civilian clip from Earth finally punched through blackout filters. Somewhere in a city street packed with terrified people, someone had captured the first credible report that the alien fleet was falling apart. The clip was shaking, low quality, full of tears and disbelieving laughter. Strangers were grabbing each other. Some were crying from relief. Some were just staring up at public screens as if they could not reconcile what they were seeing with the fear that had possessed them hours earlier. Rice watched the clip for 2 seconds, then looked away. He could not afford relief yet. Maybe not for years. Mar followed his gaze to the widening galactic fracture map. What do we even call this? No one answered immediately. Victory was too small a word. Deterrence was too honest a lie. War implied a shape that events had already exceeded. At last, Vale gave the only answer that felt true. "Contact," she said. The room absorbed it. Not first contact. Not successful contact. Just contact. Between one civilization that had mistaken order for permanence and another that had learned, through every scar in its history, how to turn pressure into change faster than anyone sensible should. Outside the vault, celebrations and alarms were probably rising together by then. Across the Empire, command centers were failing. Local governors were improvising. Fleets were choosing which truths to obey. And populations that had never imagined the center could fracture were beginning to understand that the future had just been forced open. Humanity had not become ruler of the stars. That fantasy belonged to old empires. What humanity had become was worse for its enemies, and far more difficult for history. The species everyone would now have to reckon with. And somewhere beyond the wounded local fleet, beyond the collapsing imperial chains, beyond the first wave of wars, treaties, rebellions, opportunists, and terrified new alliances that would follow, one immense open question now waited in the dark. The galaxy knew what humans were capable of. What would humanity decide to become now that the entire starscape was finally paying attention?